With that, let us get to our lecture for today. Chantal Zakari is a Turkish-Levantine artist and a professor of the practice at the School of the Museum of Fine Arts at Tufts University. She trained as a graphic designer and works in many media and formats, including web-based hypernarratives, artists' books, photography, ceramic plates, resin cast sculptures, and oil paintings produced in China. Her work examines social issues from the installation of big box stores to tensions between secular and religious cultures through the intersections of personal narratives, history, and popular culture. In 2020, she published an artist's book called Drop Dead Gorgeous, which brings together scientific photographs, scientific illustrations, and editorial illustrations of the COVID-19 virus to think about the aesthetics of scientific photography and the chronological unfolding of this pandemic. She published a second edition of the book in February 2021, which carries the story through to the introduction of vaccines. So thank you, Professor Zakari, Chantal, for joining us today. We look forward to hearing more about your work, and I know that the students have lots of really thoughtful questions for you. I've gathered a number of them together, which we'll get to a little bit later in the class. So with that, I will turn this over to Chantal.
Thank you. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Adrian. Thank you, the Humanities Center, for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here. This is really my first day at school. This is a warm-up for me. I'm not starting until next week, and thank you for giving me that opportunity to actually start articulate my words. Are you able to hear me clearly? That's the one thing I want to ask first, because there is still some construction in the background here. And the second thing is, oh good, thank you for giving the thumbs up. The second thing is, I'm going to start my PowerPoint presentation. I have two screens here, so it could get a little complicated for me, but I'm pretty sure I'm not going to be able to see the Zoom window when I do my PowerPoint. So if anybody has any questions, just say it out loud. I'm not going to be able to see the chat. Am I able to share? Yeah, okay. I think, are you guys seeing a big gray screen now? And are you guys able to see? Oh, I do see the Zoom. Okay, thank you. Sorry, I'm not totally fluent in doing this. I gotta stop this. I wish I had a chance to practice how my monitors were going to look. Okay, so which monitor are you seeing?
Your name in a blue box.
Okay, that's not a bad thing. That's good. Give me a minute to change my preferences just once again. Okay, I think this should work with my two screens. Okay. All right, which one are you seeing? That'll be the wrong one. Yeah.
Click on swap displays. Go back to what you were just on.
Yeah.
At the top, see swap displays?
Yes.
Try that.
Oh, good. You don't want to see my notes. I want to see my notes.
There we go.
Okay, good. I think this is working now. All right. And if I look up, it's not like I'm looking at somebody else in the room. I'm looking at my other display. So sorry for the awkward look, but here we are. Let's see. Yeah, so I'm going to talk to you about two books that I made. This was a very spontaneous project. As Karen said, my interest as an artist is to think about how we communicate. And I usually work on a project where I'm excited to learn about this topic. and usually work on a project that reveals some truth on visual communication. So during the pandemic, I started thinking about the imagery of COVID-19 and how the virus was represented. I was especially looking at the aesthetic of the imagery from an artistic standpoint. And I started collecting every image I could find. My studio is my laptop, and my practice often includes Google searches, sourcing imagery online. I love Agnes Varda. I don't know if you guys have seen the movie The Gleaners and I. She describes gleaners as very thrifty people, and I think of myself as a very thrifty artist. I recycle images. I collect, I organize, and then I decontextualize them, and I try to create a new narrative to tell a different story. So I collected 3 kinds of imagery. I think you should be able to see my cursor when I point here. So I collected the electromicroscopic imagery, the 3D renderings, and editorial illustrations. And all 3 had a different aesthetic and different significance to them. Usually when I start a project, I don't do the research before I start the project because I don't want my all the theory and the reading that I have to influence me, and I don't want to be ending up doing an illustrative project of what I'm reading. But about 2-3 weeks into collecting these imagery, I thought, well, who else did work on scientific imagery? And I came about this show that was organized by John Sarkovsky, the infamous photo curator at MoMA in 1967. The title of this show is Once Invisible. It's all photographic imagery that is done for scientific purposes. And in the catalog of the show, he points out that 3 things. He says he wanted to include images that were stop and extend time, and that would be Muybridge. And he wanted to include images that have vantage points that were not accessible to humans at the time, and images of sound and heat, and he described them as invisible sources of energy. So Sarkovsky said something that was interesting to me. He said, such work has been independent of artistic traditions and unconcerned with aesthetic standards. So I look at this imagery and I say, I don't think this is independent of aesthetic standards. I'm very much seduced by the beauty of it, quote unquote beauty, because that's also very open-ended. Here is a 3D rendering of the virus, and I recognize, this is not an edgy, inventive, postmodern sense of composition, but it's rather very classical. It has a lot of references to Baroque paintings, the colors, the composition, the romantic sunset-like landscape. So here is a Baroque painting I put in. It's curious to me because COVID-19 has been photographed with an electron microscope, and these photographs are really monochromatic. So the color is applied by the designer and the scientific illustrator. The color doesn't exist in the microscope. And the logic behind the coloring of the image is pretty random and left to the designer. So from an artistic standpoint, we know that there is a difference between how one views yellow or blue. In this case, COVID, in one is yellow and in the other one is blue, and how that greatly changes the meaning of the image, right? So Jim Elkins, he has a great book. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's called The Domain of Images. He does talk about scientific illustration in that book. And he says, even where they set out to mimic nature directly, graphic designers tend to choose phenomena that are not only amenable to computation, but are also in line with inherited pictorial versions of naturalism. The coronavirus image that we see daily in the news, this is the CNN version, you'll all recognize it. It has the cement texture, gray sphere with short red extensions. This was designed by Alyssa Eckert and Dan Higgins, who work with the Center of Disease Control and Prevention. I first got interested in their work after reading the New York Times article, which I assume some of you read, and I thought, this is really interesting. What a great job to have. But the article said they were asked to create an identity for the virus. So this is typically how we describe logo design, not scientific illustrations, right? In fact, some people in science would also say that scientific illustration often visualize what the data tells us, right? It's an illustration, but it also creates propositions. Sometimes they illustrate theories that have not been proven. So an image can say more than words, and may reflect things that are difficult to describe. So what we know with words may not be enough to fulfill the needs of the image completely, and the gaps are filled in by the artist. This is why I think that's a great job, because you can invent parts of the virus. Now, I was also interested in editorial illustrations, in this particular case, because it has a real social realist approach to it, in terms of how we're fighting the virus, but also because I am very aware of clip art and stock imagery as an industry. Stock illustration is really a global industry. It has created a language that is globally shared. The companies have websites and web sales in many countries, and the payment and the copyright changes from country to country, even though it's the same image. So in this case, the pandemic began in China, and many of the people illustrated were Chinese. But then soon after, the images were freely shared, say on a Turkish blog or in South Africa. And the identity of the image and the context of the image would change. The labor of creating the stock imagery also shifted quickly from China to other countries where design labor was cheaper. And the other interesting thing to me about editorial images is that they are in flux. The meaning is not embedded in the image. Many of the images were created especially devoid of meaning, so that they can fit in with various articles. Mitchell talks about the ontology of images in his book, The Reconfigured Eye. There's a great chapter there that I give sometimes to my students to read. It's called How to Do Things with Pictures. And he says what matters is what you say with an image, not their nature. And the imagery of COVID-19 fits into this very perfectly. This image might have originated in China or anywhere in the world. As I said, clip art companies are international, and the context is open-ended. And just looking at this image, you would not know if this was in an article that was pro-Chinese or anti-Chinese. And I show China as an example because that was really a lot of the imagery at the beginning of the pandemic, but it could be applied to the United States now later in the pandemic as well. So here is the book. I wanted to make a book that was 100 pages because I wanted a book to have a certain thickness. But I also wanted to limit it to 100 pages because I could have done 200 pages, but I wanted to limit the cost. And I wanted to make this accessible, not too expensive, something that anyone could buy. The cover is linen and it has foil stamped on it. I wanted it to have some kind of a middle school science book from the 1960s look, a little bit of nostalgia here. I guess what I'd like to talk about now is the structure of the book. First, I was going to group them all by color and make this a much more painterly book, kind of like a colorist. But then I thought having the story arc of a mythological hero would be much more interesting. I'm always interested in what Mircea Eliade and Joseph Campbell wrote about the hero and the miraculous birth. And I think this is really visible in COVID-19. There is this idea that COVID came from the dark, from space into the earth. and somehow it's this extraterrestrial element, not something that we already had on Earth. It has a supernatural extraterrestrial feel to it, so that fit well. But then another thing that I wanted to talk about was the universality of the image. Everyone in the world was looking at the same imagery. So my Turkish friends, at the time I had a TA who was from South Africa. I had a student in my class who was from India, another one from Korea, another one from Brazil. And they were talking to their families and they were all seeing the same image. So this to me is similar to the American experience of the Kennedy assassination from a generation ago. Every American who lived through the Kennedy assassination remembers where they were when they heard the news. Maybe Americans my generation would know the Challenger explosion. And younger Americans, I think, are very familiar with 9/11, and 9/11 probably came to the place where it was a much more universal worldly image. But this is, to me, the first phenomena where everybody in the world is seeing exactly the same images. And so what I did in the book was a reverse Google search to show how one image was used by various websites. And I don't know if on your screen you're able to see all the different languages, but it's the URL of all these different, and the article, the headline of the article of all these images and the context that they were used in. And I did this for a couple of other images in the book, this image and that image. We talked already that editorial illustrations not only reflect the content of the story, but also aestheticize the content. And, I was always surprised to see images like this, where it makes me want to breathe COVID-19 because it's so beautiful. I want to inhale it rather than run away from it. And so, here is an image where the aesthetic makes it a lot more seductive. And part of it is because editorial illustrations, their point is to entice the audience to read the article. It is really the marketing tool for the article. And as all marketing tools, its job is to seduce rather than reveal accurate content. I'm going to go through a few of these pages. Okay, back to the narrative. The logic of the hero, midway through the book does not continue. But I had to figure out a way of ending the book. And at the time, it was June. I really wanted to finish this project. I had been obsessed with it for 3 months now. I had other projects on my table. COVID was giving me a little free time in the summer, and I really wanted to work on other things and move ahead, but I didn't know how to finish the book because the pandemic had not finished. And so I had to figure out a way of ending the book. So there was a lot of talk about vaccines, and I knew that was going to be part of it. There was a lot of talk about the fight. There was a lot of talk about the deaths, a lot of the traumatic deaths that were happening, the elderly being vulnerable, people getting very, very sick. But really, the ending came to me when I read an article about bots that would be sent into the body. And I thought, this is a totally bizarre idea. This is great. It would be a great ending to my book because it will make it a perfect Hollywood ending. And so, I wanted this big explosion, the destruction of the virus, but really it was a fictitious ending because the virus had not ended. The virus is still not gone, obviously, but at least we have the vaccine. At the time, we didn't have the vaccine yet. So this is in a way my own science fiction movie, action movie. It's both Space Odyssey and Terminator at the same time. And the book ended for me right there. But then I sold out the book really fast. And December arrived and the New York Art Book Fair was in February, and I wanted to show this book at the fair. So in December, I thought, okay, I have a couple of extra images. I could add a few extra images and make a second edition. And of course, I started working on it in December. And within a few weeks, I realized I wasn't adding a few extra images. I added 71 new images. I made pretty much a brand new book halfway into the book. I still limited it to 100 images. So I deleted some images from the first edition. And so even though I call it a second edition, it's really a second book. And some of the images, the concept stay the same. This is a spread that is the same as the first edition, but I found a better image of the globe and the virus surrounding the globe, this idea of the extraterrestrial. So some of them were just pictorial adjustments, not conceptual changes. But essentially, something really changed. The media became much more aware of inequities in the world and in the US. So race and different nations became more visible in the illustrations. When I was first collecting images in April and in May, there weren't many images that made race a central topic and the inequities in different communities. Whereas now by December, we were a lot more aware of this. The world was aware of how the rest of the world was processing the COVID crisis, the economy. So that is a lot more prominent in the second book. Another thing that is prominent in the second book, you'll recognize that this was my last image from the first book. Now it's, 2/3 into the book. It's not at the end anymore. And the other element that's really in the second book, it's charts and diagrams. I think our language changed. And instead of looking at this beautiful illustration of COVID, we started looking a lot more at a diagrammatic representation of the scope of this phenomena. So a lot of charts, diagrams, and maps. And then, of course, the vaccine. A big part of this book, the ending of this book, is all about the vaccine. And researching this was a lot of fun for me because, we all hear in the US, we hear about the Russian vaccine, the Chinese vaccine, but we really have not seen the advertisements. Like this is a still from a video of the Russian vaccine, which they call Sputnik. Actually, my friends in Turkey were a lot more aware of the Chinese vaccine and the advertisement for that as well. So I collected images from various websites again. And here's an image that I love because I think here the vaccine is slowly dying. I think it raises a lot of empathetic feelings, at least for me. In the slow death of this vaccine, which I also find bizarre because, here again, we're in the scope of, I know a lot of people who got sick. I know several people who have lost family members. I know people who have died. And so for me, the empathy goes to the human tragedy. But it was interesting to me to find these illustrations where the vaccine is being represented as the one that is being victimized. And of course, the vaccine, as it is dying or as it is being destroyed, it still is gorgeous and beautiful. And I'm not showing you, I guess, the last page of the second edition. But what I am showing you here is the long list of credits that I give at the end of each book. This is the end of the second book, so I've only included the new pictures. All the pictures are in the first book listed as well. And I thought maybe some of you would be interested in seeing the different versions of the cover design that I was playing with, how I wanted something that was more photorealistic, but then ended up with or something that was more playful and then ended up with the scientific illustration for the book cover. Here are all my sketches. I was also trying to figure out ways of making the book only produced online through this company called Chapbook. But then I didn't like their design software. So eventually I designed it in InDesign and printed it print on demand, but it is a company that has an Indigo press. So it's a little better than Blurb. It's much better than Blurb and Lulu, actually. Yeah, and this is the books arriving at home. And this is the cover of the second book. I think that's all I have to show. So thank you for your attention. Let me see if I can stop sharing. Karen, I saw that you sent me some questions. I'm happy to entertain questions. I don't know how long of a time we have.
So everybody in the class has submitted questions, so I've got 100 questions.
Okay.
I chose some of them that struck me as particularly significant, but I did also want to show you, so we have a classroom of people. There's about 50 some odd people here, and there's another 60 on the Zoom. So before I get to some of the questions I chose, does anybody, those of you who are here, does anybody want to ask their question to start us out? You all have one ready to go? Yeah.
Is there anything you would have done differently now that you
You'll have to repeat that because I can't hear the room. Yeah.
Is there anything that you would have done differently now that you have sort of gotten to the end of this? Is there anything you'd change?
Always, always. I'm a designer, and I think when you're trained as a designer, all you do is make little changes and little adjustments until the very end. And you know, I have a book that I worked on for 10 years, and I was ready to send it to press, and 5 minutes before that, I was still moving things a little bit to the right, a little bit to the left, shifting things around. I have a very, very difficult time making commitments, but conceptually what I would change, I don't know, the second book is still pretty current. So the science has to change, the story, the narrative of what we're living through has to change. And, you know, a lot of my friends call the second edition the vaccine edition. So now we are in the vaccine edition era. And maybe once we go through this, I'll have a different perspective of what else could be added to create a third edition if necessary. I mean, the politics is very interesting to me. You know, I am fascinated and very saddened and very, very angry by how it has been politicized. And, you know, some people are completely anti-vax. And in my family, there are 2 people who are not vaccinated, and I have to find a lot of empathy to understand their point of view and to reach out to them. But I'm totally aware that the polio vaccine did not have that. And if we had this controversy with the polio vaccine, we would have all been still very sick from polio, and some of us dead from polio. So I am interested in that tension. I could see that that could be part of the third book. But I think it's too soon to think about what else to add. I need to wait and see how the story changes. And that's the challenge of doing something that is current, I think. You have to kind of, you know, have a distance from it before you include it in your work.
Thank you. So one thing I did just want to, how best to put this? One thing I wanted to make clear, because it wasn't totally clear to me from questions that everyone understood, is that Chantal, you didn't change any of the images that are in the book from what you found. You've you've taken them, you've selected them, you've layered things, but the images themselves, the color that are in there, that everything is as you found it, right?
Yes. Can you guys see this? At the very end, I have a disclaimer that, you know, no images were harmed. And I want to say that this is one of the rare projects where I really did not use Photoshop. The images are really printed exactly how I downloaded from the internet. And I'm kind of lucky because this press I use, the Indigo press, is a highly saturated press. So when the books first arrived, especially the first book, I opened it up and it was like, oh my God, these are electrifying colors. I thought it looked really garish. It looked terrible. None of my books are this bright and saturated. And I had a really hard time accepting it. Now, you know, I see it as it's the medium, you know, these are garish images and these are very colorful images. And yeah, I did not manipulate one single image here. And I'm good at Photoshop. It's not because I don't know my tools. I just deliberately did not touch them.
Yeah, because that's one thing a lot of people had asked about, the sort of significance of color and why did you choose it? But I mean, really, that it's inherent to the images. Anybody else who's here want to ask that question? I will say the second edition of the book is floating around the room.
Oh, good.
Anybody
Okay.
else?
So there are some
Here.
questions on the chat.
Yes. Do you want to go to one of those?
You told such a wonderful story to narrate your spectacular images. Have you considered an audio? No, I hate my voice. I would never. I mean, unless I could find like a great actress with a great voice to tell the story. No, and part of it is that I am very interested in the visual narrative. And I think you sent a question that talked about adding text.
Yes, that was actually the next one I was going to ask you. Yeah, from Alex Long.
Yeah, so all my books have text and image. I am interested in the book format because it is an artistic medium where you can connect text and image. I do a lot of photography, and for me, photography alone is never enough. I want to put them into a greater context. And so text for me is important. And I never see text as a caption to my images. I see it always as something that will give you a different perspective. So I do a lot of interviews. I use a lot of found text, newspaper clippings, you know, because I'm interested in looking at culture and people and their individual stories. But this particular book, I think, has to be with no text because it's a visual narrative. It's almost like a children's book. In fact, I have a nephew who's, you know, adorable. He's 4 years old. And he loves this book. And often he'll tell his mother, my sister, Mom, where is my COVID book? And he's looking around. So I really want this to be a picture book, but also because I want this not to have a language. There is a lot of words in this book, not a lot, but there are some words in this book. And I had to research the alphabets and the fonts to be able to recreate them in InDesign. And I deliberately went out of my way to use many languages and many alphabets to show the scope of this phenomena.
So a related question then, Jackie Lynn had asked what techniques you use to help guide the viewers to the message you're trying to convey in your pictures. So as you put these together, what kinds of visual techniques? And again, this is a 100 level class of a total mix of students who have not necessarily thought about art really before. So what kinds of techniques do you use to kind of tell the story that you want to tell?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. And in my 100th level class, the first assignment we make is text and image relationships. You know, there is no equation for it. I cannot tell you, you know, I put this next to this, but sequencing is a really important tool that we artists have. You put an image of me next to an image of Trump and the relationship is different. You put an image of me next to a tree and the relationship and the story is different. One person you guys can look into is Keith Smith and his book. I love this book. It's called Structure of the Visual Book. And he talks a lot about sequencing and meaning formed through sequencing. And that chapter is brilliant because it applies to animation, it applies to filmmaking, it applies to artist books, but meaning is formed. Now, this is not easy meaning, you still have to decode it, but we're decoding images and meanings ever since we were born, right? Like there was a time when I stopped taking my daughter to the supermarket because she could recognize the logos and all the images on the products, and she was totally seduced by wanting to buy this stuff, right? So this is, advertisement is one place where we see a lot of visual language, TV, the news, right? If you look at any news, there is, you know, an image and then the story that goes with the image, and another news channel could use the same image with a different story, and the connotations and the connections you make are different. So there is really no equation here, except it becomes a language, and the more you use that language, the more proficient you become. For me, you know, the artist book is a good place to use this language carefully and, you know, think about which image will I put first and which image will I put next, right? I wish I had more concrete examples, but let me flip through the book. Maybe I can find something, but yeah, I mean, like this spread is an example. I don't know if you can see it very well, but there is the body, there is the stock market, you know, so the color definitely aesthetically holds it together because it's all red and blue. But then, you know, the connection is that the stock market is crashing, the body is falling apart. There are other connections that I've made. Let's see. I mean, it's a lot. This particular book is a lot about color because it is a picture book, and I wanted. It's also a square book. It's not very big, so I wanted that children's book look to it. But it's the juxtaposition of images that creates meaning, and meaning is very open-ended. So if you are from Turkey, you might see an image differently. If you're from China, you might understand the meaning differently. If you're from the States, you know, meaning is very culturally embedded as well. So for me, something red might mean patriotic. For you, something red might mean caution and danger. And so this is semiotics, right? The language of symbols, and it might differ from culture to culture. So the narrative you put together could be different. In this room, there are 40 people, and you could all put together a different narrative. But my aim is to somewhat control that narrative and give us some meaning to it.
Other questions from in the room? I know you all have great one. Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry. No, I'll say it and then I'll relay it.
So I love linen content, but I kind of love how you reconcile the
That's a great question. So tell me your name. Rumik. Rumik is asking, she says she loves linen bound books, but how do you sort of come to terms with making a book about COVID and then linen with the sort of surface you can't clean, the sort of tactility of it? That's a great question.
I wasn't thinking of that. I wasn't thinking about cleanliness. I wanted to have a tactile experience, and so it was important for me to have foil embossed on the book. I mean, it is part of the seductiveness of the object, right? Linen covered books are more desirable than if this had a shiny cover and looked more like a magazine or an advertisement. So I wanted some romance to the book cover. Yeah, but I wasn't thinking.
A couple of people, that's a good question. Adiba Hassan had asked what you think about the book as an object. And then someone else had asked about the shift in the cover design with the sort of triangle in the second version. And you had said you wanted 100 pages, the thickness of it. So what were you thinking of the book as an object?
Yeah, so the 100 pages was about price. You know, I'm like I said, I'm a designer. I've worked on a lot of projects. I've done budgets before. I know how expensive I want this book. I'm not making any money out of this book because I actually funded a big part of it with my faculty grant. And so I'm very lucky to have a school that supports my work. So a lot of the money is really the cost of the project. And to me, that's what's so appealing about making books is that, you know, today you go to a museum, you have to pay $14, $15, $20 sometimes to enter the museum. So I don't find museums to be democratic spaces anymore. And certainly not everybody can buy a painting because paintings could cost thousands of dollars. Even photographs can cost a lot of money. But if I can make a book that's $35, and I'm not here trying to sell you the book, but I'm just saying a $35 book is accessible, right? I am a big artist book collector. I love buying books by other artists, and I have thousands of books in my home because they're all about $20, $25, $30, $40. So the democratic aspect of the art object to me is important. And so I kept it at 100 pages because more than 100 pages, just the price was going up higher. What was the other question? Oh, the book as an object. The book as an object is really important, actually. And I talk about this in class a lot as well, because it's easy to design everything on the computer, but the computer is an abstraction, right? The computer is just, you're putting text and image together on a flat, bright surface. And the production of the book is not apparent sometimes when you're lost in InDesign and in Photoshop or Illustrator, right? So it's very important to be able to bring back that tactility and to be aware that you're creating a three-dimensional object that has weight to it and its significance and substantive. Often I will print it at home on my black and white just to get a sense of the thickness of the book or the flow of the book. But I won't have a real sense of it until it's bound. Some printers will give you a blank dummy. That is, they'll ship you the object that you're thinking completely white with blank pages, but you can see it. But I do a lot of sketches to say, well, what is this book 7 by 7 going to feel like? And should I make it 8 by 8? Should I make it 12 by 12? Or should I think about it differently? And at some point I was thinking about this book as a 5 by 5 book. Again, even more like a children's book, more and thicker, 200 pages. The first edition, actually the very first version that I sketched was much thicker and much smaller. And again, when the book gets smaller, the thickness becomes even more apparent, right? There's a relationship there. And then I had another version that was a 12 by 12, but that would have been so expensive. I really stayed away from that. But the 12 by 12 was going to be much more painterly, right? You can imagine opening a 12 by 12 book that becomes 24 by 12 when you open the spread. It's huge. But then there's also the limitation of the technology, because I'm downloading a lot of these images on the internet, or not a lot, all of them from the internet. Many of them have lower resolutions, and so the pixel would have been really prominent. I did a whole book 20 years ago called Web Affairs, and that was all about the pixel, the photograph defined by the pixel. So I love pixelization, but I thought that pixels would get in the way of the imagery of COVID here, so I didn't want the resolution to be an issue. Did that answer the question?
I think so, thank you. There are a couple of more questions in the chat. Do you want to have a look at those?
Sure. How, oh wait.
I think Adrian and then Bernard and
yes.
Alan.
Traditional book publisher. Yeah, that's a really good question. So I did not publish this through a traditional book publisher because that would have taken me a year to find a publisher, for the publisher to find a printer, and for the publisher then to find a distributor, and for this to be distributed in bookstores. So that's a much longer process. This was a very quick, spontaneous book. I've worked on projects. Web Affairs I worked on for 5 years, and the State of Ata, the Turkish book that I made, was 10 years long. So this was not a project I wanted to work on for longer than what I did. I wanted to move a lot faster. But there is also something that is very freeing in self-publishing your book, is that you can make all the decisions yourself. Distributing is not so hard if you have, if you are plugged into the community of artist books and collectors. And the New York Book Art Fair is the perfect place to be. Now many cities, the Boston Art Book Fair, there is one in LA, in San Francisco, in Canada, all around the world actually, there are artist book fairs. So if you're plugged into that community, 100 books is really not that much. You don't need a big publisher. You should also know that you never make money out of artist books. There is no money in it. It's not like you make some profit. Typically, artists who work with artist books make money selling some of the images that are in the books in a gallery space, and that's how they fund sometimes the project. But in my case, if the imagery is all found imagery, I don't even have that chance. So I know how to produce a book, I know how to design a book, I know how to do the pre-press, and for me, it's much faster to bypass the publishing industry. And in a way, I feel like it's a much more subversive act. I'm infiltrating the publishing industry, and that's also important to me. In America, there is no censorship, right? But censorship really comes from the industry itself. That is, if you go to a publisher and the publisher looks at your proposal, they typically take that proposal to their distributor and they'll say, well, what do you think? And the distributor will think about which bookstores will want to carry this book. Barnes & Noble is the biggest bookstore in the US. I think, don't write this down because I'm not sure, but it's something like 65% of all the bookstores in the US is Barnes & Noble. And so if the distributor feels like Barnes & Noble, for example, will not want to carry this book or another major book chain, then the distributor will say, I can't sell this book. And so then the publisher will not publish this book. So the censorship happens actually through the limitation of the industry, right? And so there is something extremely important about independent publishing. Should we represent biology images as artistic pictures during scientific presentations or in scientific manuscripts? I think pure artistic works allows people to process the severity of problems posed by disease. If I understand this correctly, you're talking about the aesthetic of the image, which is exactly what I was kind of questioning, is the idea that we're creating this incredibly beautiful imagery of the virus, when in fact, it's a deadly virus and it's devastating. Yeah, so that's kind of why I started with Sarkovsky, because I wanted to show that, you know, Sarkovsky at the time in 1967 had this idea that scientific imagery did not have an artistic aesthetic to it. And I was in great conflict looking at this COVID imagery, especially in April, May. I mean, I'm still very terrified, but in April, May, it felt like it was the end of the world, right? We were in this very surreal situation. And so in that fear of locking myself up in the house with my family and trying to protect everybody, going to the supermarket and washing my hands and my vegetables, I found it really disturbing to have such beautiful and seductive imagery applied. I hope I understood the question correctly.
I actually paused there for a second because there was another question that I had, which I think a student had asked about as well, which is the real tactility in some of the images. In some of the images, there's a real emphasis to create a sense of sort of surface texture and a kind of physical feel to things. And then in others, it's very sort of flat and matte and blank. And there was one in particular toward the end of the book where it has it that is almost sort of too tactile. It becomes really kind of creepily tactile. I'm not sure which one it is. And I thought that really kind of gets to that point of
This one,
how, no, it was a different one. I'll find it in a moment. It was a different one where the surface texture seemed really, really palpable. And it is interesting how these images are,
Okay.
How these images are sort of intended to be realistic, but to a point, right? So use that kind of tactility to a point and then kind of back off. So as you say, they don't make something icky, unappealing, right? So I wondered if you wanted to say anything more about that, about sort of tactility in these.
Yeah. And can I also mention the opposite, which is the corporate kind of logo-like, very cold and distant ones, right? Like there is the whole page of this, which actually in the first book is slightly different than the second book. So yeah, the variety of images and the variety of visual language used was interesting to me. How you can go from the horror movie, you know, effect to the incredible, beautiful sunset to the coolness of a logo. And I think that has to do with the story we're telling and how we want to tell this story. So the corporate coolness to me is also very surprising, like this one, which is also in the second book, that turns up to look like, you know, the logo of IBM or, you know, any company. But then there is also the cartoon comical aspect of this. I'm showing you images of book one, but I have a similar page like that in book two, which is ludicrous, right? It's almost like Ghostbusters. It's got that cartoon feel to it. And, you know, I don't know if I'm judging them as much as it's, I want to show them and I want to create a lexicon, you know, an encyclopedia of the language we have created. So that, you know, 10, 20 years later, hopefully when COVID is gone, then this becomes a visual encyclopedia of the scope of the language.
So I'll ask a sort of edited version of a question that's in the comments, which just is, what has been the response to the book? You said the first edition sold out, which is remarkable. The second edition, I know I have 40 of 100, so getting to at least halfway. So what has been the response to the book?
Well, so I did get some press, you know, popular press. I got some reviews in art publications as well, but popular press like the Boston Globe picked up on this. And it's, you know, somewhat uncomfortable because on one hand, I know people really appreciate this work, and I think I like it as well. On the other hand, I think there is a cutesiness, quote unquote cutesiness to this project. Like in November, there was a woman who bought 5 copies of it because it was a great gift. And so on one hand, you know, I understand the significance of this, like 10 years from now, again, hopefully when COVID is gone, we want to look at this and say, oh, you know, 2019, 2020, remember those days when we were all locked down with the pandemic, and then this becomes a memento of that time period. But also I think I am contributing to some degree to the seduction of the imagery, and people are seduced, and it can, you know, it turns to be a gift book. I'm okay with the ambivalence of it. I just know that I've never done a book that was this cutesy before. And that actually is a little uncomfortable for me. Usually I do more political work, but this in itself is political in the sense that it's the political interpretation of the meaning of this image. So yeah, I think if I did a 3rd edition, I will not do it as, I would like to show a little less beautiful stuff. And somebody had asked about the cover of the second one. I don't know if you guys picked up on this, but if you know El Lissitzky, you know, this is an homage to El Lissitzky's, what is it? Beat the Whites with the Red Wedge, which is really the kind of the fighting symbol of the Soviet Revolution. So it is about killing the virus, you know, and invading the virus. And he was thinking of the Red Army invading the White Palace. Yeah, so it is a populist work. It's a book that could be appreciated by non-artists. And I think that makes me feel good. But it is a little too pretty. And maybe the 3rd edition will not be as pretty. But I do want to limit it just to images of COVID. I'm not interested in putting in news photography or, you know, that's not what this is about. It should all be about COVID. Oh, wait, one interesting.
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say one interesting thing is that in both books, there are a couple of images that are not COVID-19. Even though I took them from COVID-19 articles, sometimes the editors of the publication will confuse another SARS virus or the flu for that matter with COVID. So if you see a couple that are actually, that have longer tentacles, those are not really COVID, but they've been used instead of COVID. Yeah.
We'll have to go through and find those like Easter eggs. So Daniel's put a question into the chat. And then after that, we'll probably have time just for one or two more.
The intersection of art and medicine. Yeah, this sort of relates to what I just was talking about, right? Like, I am not sure how exactly this book exists or will exist in 10 years. I mean, I am acutely aware that if you have a family member that died of COVID, that this is, you know, it is really a disturbing way of representing the virus. And I guess the comfort I have here is that I'm not really representing the virus, I'm just showing how we're representing the virus. But how the medical industry will see that, I don't know. And I'd be curious to know how the medical industry and the scientific illustrators would have a discussion. I mean, I think in some way it might be the failure of our art education that we put out in the world illustrators that do scientific illustration that looks, you know, quote unquote, pretty. I think maybe we should be much more aware of how we're creating this imagery and what we want to represent with it. And sometimes it's so easy on the computer to put these really bright colors, and maybe we should have more of a discussion on you know, how design is actually has to be responsible. There was also you know, parallel but not exactly the same. Well, anyway, that's a longer thing. I'll send it to you, Karen, as a reading. But at Harvard, there was an issue about a historical image being used on, and it was the image of an enslaved person who ended up as the image of a conference, and it was on tote bags and on posters and all that. And, you know, it created a lot of anger. And I think rightfully, I think that is the responsibility of designers. Designers need to stop focusing on aesthetic and really take responsibility on the context they put these images in. And so, yeah, that's where I'd like to
yes,
leave it.
I would absolutely appreciate that. That would be great. So we have 5 minutes. Does anyone in the room want to ask a final question?
How was your day then?
How was your day been?
It has just started. I am envious that you're all in the classroom. I'm going to be in the classroom in a week and I can't wait because I love being in the classroom. But also my daughter is starting college. Tomorrow I'm going to drop her off at the dorm. So I'm going to be a crying mother. But it's so exciting to actually be at school, isn't it?
It is nice to be back in the room with people and having a conversation. It truly is. All right, well, thank you so much, Chantal, for joining us. This has been absolutely fantastic. We get a round of applause.
Thank you for all your questions. I think they were really excellent questions.
Yeah, and it's been a fantastic way to start the semester. I'll leave this open for a second. I see there's another question that's just popped up in the chat there. So if you have a moment, and if anybody else wants to come and say hi, but otherwise, thank you so much. And I will be in touch. This has been absolutely fantastic. And thank you, everybody, for your attention and your excellent questions. And I will see you next week on, no, Thursday. So,
Thank you.
Bye, guys. Bye. Bye. Thank you, Karen.
I can leave it open for a few more minutes if you want to answer a couple of
That'd
questions.
be great. Thank you.
Sure.
Uh,
What work are you planning to do next concerned relatively with international issues? I am taking it, this is about edition 3. Yeah, because I'm not working on this project anymore. I have 2 other projects now. So I might come back to this in a year and revisit it.
What are your other projects?
I live blocks away from the Watertown Arsenal. So it's been about 5 years. I've been working about the history of the Arsenal and how as a space now it is being transformed. This is where major arms and cannons were built for the Civil War, World War I, World War II. There was even an atomic reactor blocks away from my home. And so I've really been looking at labor there, the immigrants that work there, and the history of the buildings and the machines that were produced. But I have another project too, where I teach in a prison system, and I'm collaborating with my students where they tell me a place to go to, and I drive there and I photograph based on their request. You know, that I bring them back the photograph that they cannot see. So hopefully that will become a book as well.
Well, it
I
looks
think it's
all right, well, I've got us back on. All right, so has everybody gotten questions in, do we think? Looks like most people have headed out. All
yeah,
right,
you can always email me questions if you have other questions.
great. Thank you, Chantal. This is really fantastic. And I
Thank
know
you.
the students will enjoy looking at